Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. Dying out from the northern direction, we see here in the direction of Avdiivka that the Russians have managed to advance in two separate directions. Since the start of March, the Russians restarted offensive operations in the direction of Avdiivka, where they first off started advancing here to the south of the industrial area to the east of Avdiivka. And now they're advancing in the central and the northern parts of the village. And with this, we see that there is some attempt by the Russians right now with infantry assault groups to advance further and further towards Avdiivka before storming the village, as they've stormed many other villages over the past few months. Moving further south in direction of Bakhmut, in the direction of Ivanivske itself, we see that the Russians have advanced within the village and are now reaching the center in the northern parts. And with this advancements, the Russians have cut off the main road here to the north of Ivanivske, and the Russians are looking to capture the western parts and move further southwards to cut off the Ukrainians completely from any access to and from the village. And with that, we see that the Russians are continuing their offensive operations here within Ivanivske itself as they try to push the Ukrainians out and gain control of it. The Ukrainian positions here in Ivanivske are reaching a breaking point that they're losing more and more control over the village, with the majority now in Russian hands. The Ukrainians are having difficulties resupplying the area and sending reinforcements to the area because they're pressured on many points on the front line, which means that they will eventually have to sacrifice some areas. Ivanivske is extremely important to the Ukrainians because it is the symbol of any form of potential for the Ukrainians to recapture Bakhmut on the short term, not in years, but in months. But that is about to fall into Russian hands, and if the Russians capture Ivanivske, the whole eastern part of the canal from the western parts of Bakhmut and to the north by Avdiivka and to the south all the way to Avdiivka will likely all fall into Russian hands if they control Ivanivske, and the Russians can start operations in the direction of Chasiv Yar. Moving further south in the direction of the west of Avdiivka, the fighting here has reached a stalemate. The Ukrainian offensive operations, counterattacks towards these three villages have reached a halt. The Russians are now trying to regain the initiative and repositioning their forces to try and start their own offensive against their own counterattack, if that's what we want to call it. In the end, it's just offensive operations, and the Russians are looking to likely gain full control over all three villages. They already have control over Avdiivka, but a part of it is in the gray zone, while Tonenke and Berdychi are mostly under Ukrainian control in some areas, and other areas they are under firm Russian hands. What we see is here to the north of Tonenke, there is this geolocated footage which shows Russian positions here to the north of the village, which indicates that the Russians are looking to flank the Ukraine positions within Tonenke by attacking it head on and also attacking it from the north. There will likely ensue battles here to the west of Tonenke, as the Russians will look to flank it from the west as well to attack the Ukrainian positions from three different directions. The main reason for that is if we take a closer look to Tonenke, we see that there are two roads under Ukrainian hands in and out of the village. If the Russians attack from the western parts, they can gain control over the western road, and from the northern parts, they can flank the northern positions, but there will be no access to the road itself. So the Russians would have a best potential to actually cut off the roads or to force the Ukrainians out of the village by attacking from the western flank. So that is likely a target for the Russians to advance here in the western parts and cut off the roads in and out of Tonenke, which would allow the Russians to gain full control over the village. In the Avdiivka direction, the Ukrainians are attacking from the western parts and northern parts from Stalemate, but they're mainly trying to hold on to the defensive positions here, as it is important for them to hold on to Stalemate and Berdychi as a sort of twin village where they are both connected in the western parts of Berdychi here. With this, we see that the Ukrainians are moving back and forth between the two villages to establish their positions and launch counterattacks, and the village of Berdychi is where we're seeing the 47th Mechanized Brigade launching their counterattacks with the Abrams, which so far has seen the loss of multiple Abram tanks. Moving further south here in the direction of Pervomaiske, there's been further Russian advances within the town itself, and we're seeing that they're getting closer and closer to the central parts of it. We have seen a lot of positional fighting here within the town itself. The northern parts have reached a stalemate a long time ago, where the Russians nor the Ukrainians have launched any offensive operations to try and improve their positions. Instead, what we've seen is that the main part of the fighting had taken place in this central part. And over the past few months, the Russians have now captured this whole central part, leaving what amounts to that exact position left in Ukrainian hands. We're seeing that the Russians are getting closer and closer to capturing Pervomaiske, as their offensive operations in Avdiivka and to the west of it have seen much more success. The Russians are now launching a lot of small assaults towards the Ukrainian positions, small armored vehicles moving through to the front line and trying to improve their positions. And this has left the central parts in the grain zone, and likely the Russians will gain control of that, which will allow them to connect the northern and southern parts. And with that, they will have a lot of opportunities to move further in a western direction without having to worry about their flanks. Something very interesting, though, is the fortifications. Here to the south of the town, we see that there are multiple layers and multiple separate fortifications of the Ukrainians. So if the Russians manage to advance further here by Nevelske and capture the village, and move further in Pervomaiske and capture the town, there are still these fortifications they have to fight through to push the Ukrainians out, or they could simply go around them by through Nitailove and then completely ignore them, but having their flanks exposed to these Ukrainian fortifications is detrimental in and of itself. So it is likely that we will see continuous efforts by the Russians to capture more of these fortifications, as they have been to the south of Nevelske before attacking the village itself. So you'll likely see the Russians either, after capturing Nevelske here to the south, move in a northern direction and do it in a pincer maneuver where they attack from both sides and a head-on attack from the east as well, or they would simply move in a northern direction towards it head-on and capture it that way. Either way, it will likely require a lot of artillery preparation and a lot of FPV drones to try and hit the Ukrainian positions there. This is why the underground rooms within these trench areas are so important. If the Ukrainians have that area to just close the door and stay inside under the ground, the FPV drones can't really do anything to them. But if they're exposed in the trenches itself, the FPV drones have them as easy targets. Moving further south in the direction of Pobjeda, the Russians have managed to capture the fortifications here to the southwest of the village, and with this they're moving on to the next parts, which would be here to the south, here in the direction of Avdiivka, or northwest in the direction of the fortifications to the northwest of the village. There is a trench line and fortifications here to the northwest of Pobjeda, which is essential for the Russians to fight through if they want to advance further westwards from Marinka in a larger operation. This is a fortification that is a very forward position away from all the other fortifications to stand as a barrier prior to this whole open field area. The Ukrainians have no significant positions in all of this area. This means that if the Russians capture these fortifications here to the south of Avdiivka, they can start advancing here through the villages and towns towards the Berdychi river here to the west and to important parts in the next line of defense. Until that, the Russians will be focusing on Krasnoorivka here to the north and the fortifications to the south of Marinka before they start moving in a westward direction. As for the final frontline developments here to the south in the direction of Avdiivka, the Russians have made an advancement to the south of the town, getting a foothold here in the southern parts, as well as in the central parts of the town, where they have managed to advance a slow advance here to the east, with this geolocated footage by the church, which indicates their former advances are now confirmed with visual confirmation and geolocation. So with these advances, we see that Avdiivka fighting continues as the Russians are trying to improve their positions and have sent additional forces and reinforcements to capture the town. Again, this is something that adds up. The Ukrainians are now fighting in heavy battles all throughout the front line due to the concentration of forces here to the west of Avdiivka to launch these counterattacks. They've had to leave other towns, other positions, Berdychi, Ivanivske, and others, with less forces than what they need to actually hold back the Russian advances. The 5th Armored Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces here in Ivanivske and other brigades in other parts are very strong brigades, but they're not able to hold back the Russians by themselves. They need additional forces, which the Ukrainians currently do not have. They're stretched thinly across the front, and if this trend continues where the Ukrainians are fighting the Russians without enough forces and in positions that aren't properly fortified and prepared, then the Russians will increase the rate at which they are gaining their advantage to properly gain the upper hand in this conflict and start launching these offensive operations, which are expected by the summer. The main reason it is expected by the summer because that is at the point pretty much every analyst out there expects that the Russians will have the upper hand to such a degree that they're able to launch these large offensives to go beyond the fortified areas of the Donetsk region and into the more open areas, which are much more advantageous for the Russians to be fighting in. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.